There are 16 officially recognized indigenous tribes, as well as several non-recognized tribes spread across Taiwan's mountains, coastal plains, and offshore islets. Taiwan's indigenous population totals 570,000, ranging from the Kanak-Kanavu's 370 people to the Amis more than 210,000. Like most indigenous communities around the world, Taiwan's native people suffer oppression and displacement after the arrival of technologically advanced colonizers. Since the Dutch built a permanent settlement in Taiwan more than 400 years ago, Han Chinese and Japanese have both claimed sovereignty over the island, while intruding on tribes' land and disrupting their societies. On August 1st, 2016, Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen became the first head of state in Asia to apologize to the country's indigenous peoples. Today, economic and educational disparities between indigenous peoples and Han Taiwanese still prevail. One study in 2017 showed the average annual income of indigenous households was around $25,200, lower than the national average of around $34,700. Over the past decade, indigenous people in Taiwan consistently earn less than the majority. The monthly wage gap was $352 in 2019. In terms of higher education, although more than 90% of indigenous students enrolled in post-secondary education, their college entrance rate is only 53.9%, compared to the 85.8% rate of Han Taiwanese.
400年来，每一个曾经来到台湾的政权，透过武力征伐、土地掠夺，强烈侵害了原住民族既有的权利。为此，我代表政府向原住民族道歉。
Since the early 2000s, efforts have been made to guarantee the well-being of indigenous communities and facilitate social mobility. The Indigenous Peoples Employment Rights Protection Act passed in 2001 mandates that there be at least one indigenous person per 100 employees in governmental bodies and public schools. In agencies located in designated indigenous areas, that proportion must reach a third. Compared to other ethnic groups, indigenous students can receive up to 35% more points on college entrance exams, as long as they receive indigenous language certification.
第一个就是所谓的这个福利政策，它其实它并不是非齐头式，它也不是不平等。
Jolin Xie, director of Donghua University's Center for International Indigenous Affairs. She originates from the Siraya tribe located in western Taiwan.
好，那台湾的这个，譬如说考试额外加分啊等等这些，因为它是考量到第一个它是外挂名额，它没有竞争到所有任何内部的，好，这是一点。那第二个，它其实就是我们过去从比例上面来，我们从比例上面来讲，我们的确发现城乡的差异其实是大的。那原住民族会有一个，就是你的文化认同越高，你的语言能力越强，你很可能就在这个主流社会里面的其实就不够强。譬如说，你可能会被人家讲说你没有办法参加演讲比赛，因为你发音可能不准。或者是说，你考试的时候，你就是没有办法用记忆式的那个方式去做这样子的一个竞争。
第一个就是恢复主权。
As more indigenous Taiwanese retrieve their identities, calls for self-governance are intensifying. Post-colonial indigenous self-rule has occurred in various forms across the world. In Canada, the Constitution Act 1982 recognizes existing Aboriginal and treaty rights. New Zealand's Treaty of Waitangi, established between the Maori and the Crown in 1840, provided the Maori with grounds to claim reparations and retrieve land confiscated during colonization. In Taiwan, however, the two-decade effort to enshrine the right to self-governance into law has not come to fruition.
原住民族的自治法其实最终的目的就是原住民族的自觉跟永续发展，这个是最核心的目的。
Wang Ruiying, he's the director of General Planning Department at the Council of Indigenous Peoples, the highest agency managing indigenous affairs in Taiwan.
可是这一部法案5进5出立法院，到目前为止送进立法院5次，然后届期不弃成退回5次。那这其中有程序性的立法，也有实质性的立法那 当然就是说不论哪一种采哪一种的立法方式都没有在立法院通过。那归结它的原因其实有两种，等于说比较主要的原因，一个就是第一个原住民族自治跟地方自治，它中间一定会有冲突。有一些原民团体一直标榜就是民族的主体性，然后要求的自治的程度要非常的高，但是这种状态的话，你就很难有一个衡平。
According to the mentioned bill, an indigenous government is an independent public juridic person, which means local governments ought to consult it and obtain consent before developing land or exploring resources on its territory. Redrawing the existing administrative divisions for indigenous governments also means redistributing local budgets. Take Kaohsiung City, for example. If all 3 of its indigenous townships were to establish their own government, Kaohsiung would lose almost $350 million in subsidies per year based on the size of its remaining divisions. In the eastern county of Taidong, almost 100% of the townships are categorized as indigenous. The municipality might lose even more of its budget to an indigenous government if it were established there.
我就说，假设我们没有这个自治法的时候，我怎么样来谈说，我西拉雅族、我泰雅族、我赛德克族、我阿美族，我想要进行什么样的教育权？那我们现在国家其实常常都是用一体适用的方式，可是这个一体适用的方式在上面，它到各个族群，它有不同的文化背景的时候，它常常就是行不通的。好，但是我们没有自治的话，我们的教育权、语言、文化、政治、经济发展的规模，它要发展的方式，它其实没有办法去主导，有那个所谓的 sovereign right 在里面。
Last August, the Council of Indigenous Peoples introduced the latest version of the Indigenous Self-Governance Bill in Taiwan's legislature. Local governments and indigenous tribes now have an opportunity to find common ground, on which indigenous communities could revive their traditions without cities being deprived of municipal resources. Whether or not lawmakers finally prioritize this long-awaited law, history indicates that self-empowerment and perseverance are what it takes to fight for indigenous rights.